Our first panel discussion this afternoon is comprised of Mr. John Hennessy, who is the chairperson of the Higher Education Authority, which is the statutory planning and policy development body for higher education and research in Ireland. Ms. Una Halligan, chairperson of the Expert Group on Future Skills Needs, an advisory board to the Irish government on the skills needs of the economy and on other labour market issues that affect Ireland's enterprise and employment growth. Kathleen Lynch, professor of equality studies at UCD. Michael Cronin, professor in the School of Applied Languages and Intercultural Studies at DCU. And Mary Corcoran, professor of sociology at NUIM. The panelists who will discuss academic freedom, the university, and society have been asked to respond to the following questions. How do you define academic freedom? Should there be limits on academic freedom? If so, who or what imposes these constraints? And can Ireland afford academic freedom? Professor Corcoran will moderate this discussion. Professor Corcoran.
Thank you very much, Rowena. And can I just say as a prelude to the session that on behalf, I think, of all my colleagues at NUI Maynooth and indeed colleagues nationally, I'm extremely grateful to the three deans at NUI Maynooth for visualising this conference and bringing it to fruition, because we know how difficult it is to organise anything in these days when everyone's busy 24/7. And I think I'd also obviously like to extend a welcome to our high-level panel. I think that's the kosher term, isn't it? High-level panel here today. And I'm sorry that Rowena did the introductions, because I wanted to quote Louise Holden in the Irish Times, who described John Hennessy as a purebred industrialist. And I was wondering if that makes the rest of us muggles. That's my Harry Potter
Lesser
reference.
Lesser
okay. As Rowena has pointed out, we do have some kind of sensitising questions to get us going. But maybe to get a link with the previous presentation, we might just start at the point perhaps where it was coming to the end, where Terence mentioned or put out the challenge that maybe academics are supine, and then in response to that people said, well, is it being eroded? Is there, if you like, a chilling effect running through the halls of academia? And what is the impact of that on academic freedom? So I might start perhaps at the left side of the table and begin maybe just asking Kathleen to reflect on that as a senior academic, whether you do think there is a chilling effect in relation to academic freedom.
Well, I would say there has always been. I don't think that academic freedom and threats to it are particularly new. As somebody who started in UCD many years ago, establishing a new field of scholarship, to say that there was little support from my great peers for breaking the boundaries of disciplines is putting it politely. So I think that, in fact, there is often power and sovereignty and control and regulation within the academy itself. So I think that that's something that we need to be mindful of. There are vested interests within the academy as well as vested interests outside. Do I think it's true now? Yes, I do. I think it's more so now. I was interested in the last speaker. I don't know if you know the work of Lisa Leibowitz in Cornell on the sciences. And she has found, her research shows that 50% of people working in the biological sciences in the United States also work as consultants to industry. So I think there is, if you are funded by industry or if you're funded by even the state, sometimes, depending on the terms and conditions laid down, you are, of course, constrained. And we see that even in relation to EU funding, which I've been very involved in, there are constraints. But I think the point that Padraig Cogan made is very important, and that is, you must be prepared to stand apart from power if you're an academic. And I don't think that that is actually part of our training or education. You have to stand apart from the power of your discipline when you dissent from it, because there are always reigning orthodoxies within it. And you have to stand apart sometimes from your institution, And I just think, I got great advice once from a member of the law faculty when I was quite a university, and she said to me, I'd just like to remind you, she said, if you actually are true to your principles as an academic, remember you are not often going to be popular, either within your field or maybe within your institution. So I think that that is a big, big question. And I would go back to positivism and the whole influence of that training and tradition within the academy, whereby there has been so much emphasis on kind of, if you like, a very narrow brand of kind of scientific investigation, where the ethics of what we do and the reason for what we do it, why we do it, and the whole lack of often critical reflection on the purpose of it is actually often not addressed. And what I'm saying is the separation between fact and value, which has been, I suppose, institutionalized in the academy for good reason, but I think it's also very problematic. I don't know if people are familiar with the recent work of Andrew Sayer, who has written a new book on the whole problem of the academy and its failure to address the problem of values within the positivist tradition. So I think that that is a very serious issue, because often we have to ask, what is the purpose of some science? And what is the purpose of some scholarship? And who does it serve? So I do think there are threats, I suppose, but I think it's a matter of educating people. I think we need a different kind of education in the academy as well. I'll come back to that, but I think we need to do it.
All right. Can I actually go over to John on this one, perhaps, because obviously you're someone that we would associate with promoting a commercialisation agenda within the academy and so on as a good thing for our society and our economy. I mean, how do you think that you can maintain academic freedom and pursue a commercialisation agenda simultaneously?
Yes, I do believe they can both coexist together, and I think it's very important to do that. And I would be an advocate, even from outside of academia, an advocate of academic freedom. I think it's very important in terms of the creation of new knowledge. I probably would add the proviso that that has to be contextualized in addressing, be it social, be it environmental, be it economic problems, and so on. But I do believe that is an important facet. I think listening to Dr. Harron, I think there was a couple of issues that arose for me specifically in that. There was some nice pieces of learning, but there was a couple of kind of principles that arose during it. And I think the first one was that we spoke about the history of academic freedom. You know, in the 400 or 500 years since the subject has been aired, there has been a lack of uniformity around the definition of it, and I think that's a good thing. I think that when it comes to academia, we need diversity as a fundamental working hypothesis. But I think the relevance today and to then, I think we need to look at contextually that there are differences. For example, you know, the way countries were governed, be they governed by the monarchies or by the churches and so on, that has disappeared and has been disaggregated. And now we have a new form of governance, which is we must earn the respect from people and colleagues. So I think it's very important that we take that attribute into account. I think in terms of the question of conformance, I was surprised by the lack of and the differences between the different countries around conformance. But I think some of that may be down to the newer states and the more recent written constitutions. But I would emphasize the importance of diversity in everything that is done in academia. And I think as part of the work I'm involved in the Higher Education Authority around the new national strategy, very important that the diversity of missions continue to coexist across the whole spectrum of the system. I think the other point I want to make about academic freedom is that survival and not allowing this generation eroded so that the next generation picks up something of a lesser entity. I think it's important that we move from having it protected by statute to have it protected by earning respect. I think that's a very important facet of it. But to address the direct question of academic freedom itself, I think that academia has to be free to do and search do the critical thinking and be able to challenge the status quo, obviously without breaking the law, obviously acting with proper judgment and so on. But I think that the discussion on academic freedom cannot be done on the basis of just discussing academic freedom. It's academic freedom within an institution that should have autonomy, where autonomy is exercised. And that autonomy brings with it, as we heard earlier, certain benefits, but also certain responsibilities. And what, from a commercial environment point of view, I would express a strong view that we have been less able to exercise the responsibility and accountability piece. We can all see the benefits of this thing, but we need to stress and work more towards getting the accountability and the responsibilities more inbred into what we do and how we do it.
Okay. All right. Can I come to you on that, Michael? Just that notion that Tom has raised there, that it's important for academics to earn respect, that's something that perhaps we haven't been doing enough of?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two things I would say. Is one is the notion of academic freedom. It's very, very difficult to find anybody who will say it's a very, very bad idea, or it's a terrible idea, or that freedom should be removed from university. Usually people remove freedoms from universities do something with freedom. I mean, one of the most common items in the lexicon of the National Socialist Party in Germany in the 1930s was freedom. And somebody did a statistical analysis of the propaganda that was used by the Nazis. And the word they used most commonly was the word freedom. And that when your freedom was removed, it was in the name of freedom. So I'm always slightly sceptical about this kind of public commitments that are made to the preservation of academic freedom, because what seems to me much more important than personal declarations of intent are structural actions and structural agencies, and how structures are composed, if you like, to produce particular responses. And one of them, for example, is this notion of, earning the respect. I agree with John. It does seem like a very desirable kind of public good that we should earn the respect of the society which surrounds us. But the problem in terms of democratic governance in Europe, and I absolutely agree with John, we're going through a very severe crisis, but the problem is that democratic governance is going completely the wrong way. In other words, it's playing into the hands of the markets. If you look at what tend to be increasingly the important decision-making bodies in Europe, the European Central Bank, the European Commission, the way the Troika is intervening in this country. And what you're having are people who don't have a direct electoral mandate, who aren't directly accountable in a democratic sense, who are making decisions about the future and present state of public goods. So in terms of earning our respect from the larger society, I think we've got to also bear in mind what's happening to the larger society and what democratic accountability is. And one thing I think is important, and I hope we can pick this up in the discussion, is that it's very, very important to not to isolate academic freedom from other kinds of freedoms in the society. There was a documentary that was made by Mary Raftery a number of years ago called States of Fear about institutional abuse in Irish orphanages and so on in the country. And I can't think of a better description of the present state of Ireland. It seems to me we've gone from one state of fear, which is the priest, to the other state of fear, which is the P45. It's kind of one regime of fear is giving way to another. And how this kind of politics of fear operates is through a kind of a cult of surveillance, transparency, accountability. These words that sound very nice, they sound the nice Enlightenment words. But of course the dark side of this is surveillance, co-option, detention, etc. The kinds of the dark side of that kind of enlightened notion of transparency. And what then? And you could see this, for example, in the Nyberg Commission on the Irish banking sector. One of the things that they systematically reported on in that particular report of that commission was the cult of fear. That fear was leading to kind of group thinking, was leading to a kind of herd instinct. These institutionally and incidentally were institutions that were subject to precisely the kinds of transparency and accountability mechanisms that they want to be introduced under the very interestingly titled employment control framework, these ideologies of control. But what's interesting about that is that the Irish Bank Officials Federation, when they recently made a submission to Doyle's subcommittee, said that not only had that that culture of fear not disappeared in the banks, it had intensified. So what we're proposing, if you like, seems to me, and this is the kind of structural effects of particular pieces of legislation, is to introduce a kind of an ideology and culture of fear that has been, deeply stultifying in the private sector, and we now want to bring the kind of stultifying effects of that into the public sector.
Okay, well, I think a sigh. Yes, I'll take a breath. And then I'd like to actually hand over to Una Halligan, who's from the private sector and a member of our governing authority here at NUI Maynooth. And I know that for you, things like diversity, accountability, transparency are very important. So how do you respond to Michael's culture of fear?
And it's like going from all of that to 1984 and Big Brother. Okay, I'm going to wear a couple of hats here. I am the chair of the expert group, therefore there's an element of the skills needs that I'm going to address. There's also the other one that looking at the relevance of universities. And I suppose when you talk about academic freedom, you have to say, well, what do universities do? What's the role of the university today? And when we look at relevance and we look at the universities way back in the beginning and we look at Bologna and we kind of think, yeah, that was lovely. That was shooting the breeze and they had time and they had money and they had, they were able to do that because it was only very, very rich people went to university. And there was that patronage that came with it. I think we're in a very different economic climate. And I'm going to wear my industry hat. I worked with a multinational, US multinational for 15 years. And part of the reason I got involved in the skills issue was because of the shortage of skills and the shortage of the graduates that had, let's use the commercial side of it, the skills that were needed for commerce. And that's an awful dirty word in university. But in the end of the day, I have 2 children who went to university, and they went to university because they loved the life in university, but they went to get a job. So employability has to be part of the rationale. And whether you take academic freedom in as the piper pays the tune, and therefore the government says this is the policy, this is the economic policy, and universities have then got to go play that line, that's a difficult balance. And I think it's up to the universities to find where that balance is, because they also have the right to say, if you look at the labour activation programmes that have been put out there in the last 12 months, 2 years, and where their money is being streamed, and I put up my hands here, you can call me a Philistine, but I've been part of the government advisory on that, on where that should be streamed in relation to the ICT areas, the green economy, and where the jobs are going to be and where the shortages are at the moment that we're looking at it, because we're producing graduates that can't get jobs. And we're bringing in, the IDA will tell you, we're bringing in multinationals and even indigenous companies that can't get the right skills. So that mismatch has to be addressed. Now, I don't know whether that clips your wings a bit on your academic freedom or not, and quite frankly, I don't care, because I do think in economic terms we have to be realistic, we have to be pragmatic. And I think what I would say the challenge for universities is to actually use the super brains you have in addressing the problems and the needs that we have, and use your academic freedom and use your cop on to kind of say, let's do the best we can in these stringent times for the young people, and I would say also mature students that you get back in, because I think that's going to be hugely important, the upskilling of people who have the wrong skills. So I think there's a whole element here that's probably, and maybe me very contentious, but that's what it's all about. But I do think we have to get that balance. And I'm coming from, as I say, both as a parent, somebody from industry, and also somebody who's involved with skills and the whole rationale behind where industry links with universities and employability of our young people and of our population.
Okay. Thank you very much, Una. I think Kathleen wants to come in on that. And I just want to assure you all that if you start waving at me, I'm very happy to hand over the questioning to you. So please wave if you would like to pose a question to the panel. So,
Could I just make 2 responses to the last to Una? I think it's right. Of course we need to have people who are employable. But I just want to raise something here, because it's something that it's the Force report, I'm sure you're familiar with, and particularly Eurostat, in relation to the proportion of students in Ireland who do science, maths and computing science. And it stood at 17.2%, just those 2, that didn't include engineering. 17.2%. We're 6th out of 27 in Europe in that. We were at the top, all right. But we have nearly double the number of people studying those subjects as Germany, nearly double the number of people in the United States, significantly more than many of comparative countries. For example, it's 13% in Germany, 9% in Sweden and Norway. So I'm asking, You know, we have had a long trajectory in this country, and I mean, there is one line in the McCarthy report that asks the question. You know, we have a huge concentration of research and funding in engineering, science and technology. I'm not against it, but I'm asking the question. If we have such an enormous proportion of our students studying at these fields, and I'm taking the figures from Eurostat and from Forfos, I cannot comprehend how the mismatch is occurring, because then it's the problem is in those sectors. But I want to refer to a related issue, which is the critical thinking that comes from the arts, humanities and social sciences. Because in fact, often the people who ask the most awkward questions of the people in power are those who come from those sectors, because that's what we're trained to do. And I think often one of the reasons there has been the percentage of funding, direct government funding to the arts, humanities and social sciences stands at the princely sum of 3%. I repeat, 3%. It is absolutely abysmal. So one way of closing down dissent in Ireland is to close down funding for research in the arts, humanities and social sciences. I am not against this funding of research in engineering, science and technology. I think it's extremely important. I wrote a book on this with mathematicians on the teaching of maths. I'm very interested in it. But I do think we have to look and be honest. We have in this country a gradual erosion of funding and actual support for people who think critically. And I do think that that's a very serious threat in the country, a very serious threat to critical thinking in the long term.
I think John.
Yeah, John, do you want to come in on that?
I must say that I think Kathleen has probably hit the nail on the head, and I would put it in different language, but I would say the exact same thing. We have in Ireland today a deficit in terms of leadership, and you might ask why. Because we do not have enough of critical thinkers, we do not have enough of people challenging the status quo, and it emanates from perhaps the turbocharging of the science, maths, engineering and technology in the last 15 years. We need to ensure that the arts and humanities is also maintained and sustained, but perhaps not in isolation as it has been. Again, I come back to it has to earn its own stripes. We need to develop and continue to develop the arts and humanities in the context of fusing it with the STEM subjects, so that the hard sciences are enriched by the thinking that goes on in the arts and humanities. This is something that I think that we have to do much better, and it could also explain why the investment in engineering and science over the last 15 years has not given us the rich rewards that we should have got. And I'd go on to say that as we look, we're probably today at a crossroads in terms of how we develop from here. We have been dependent as a nation on foreign direct investment to stimulate employment. Now, I think we need to develop society as well as develop the economy. And in doing so, I think that the whole area of challenging what is the status quo, the critical thinking skills that we need, bringing those out, and I guess that we have sacrificed something over the last few years with the Celtic economy in not imbuing those more broadly in science and engineering. And I think that's very important for us to recognise, because when we go to the next stage of development, we're not all the low-hanging fruit of bringing in American companies and that sort of thing is gone. We need to start Irish people coming out of what we call graduates. They must be ready to be able to set up their own businesses, create their own institutions, and grow those things. And they must have the ability not only to specialise, but also to build those critical thinking skills that I think we are borrowing from other places today.
Great. Okay, I think it would be nice to actually open it up to our community of scholars that are here in front of me. So I'm going to ask, are there any roving mic?
Well, there.
Am I good?
You have to take this one.
Take the chair. Yeah, we can share this.
Okay, here.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, Mike. Sorry, Hattie here in the centre. Oh. Do you want to just say who you are and who you wish to address your question to in the first instance?
I'm Patty Gray, I'm a lecturer in anthropology here at Maynooth. Mostly responding to what said. And to some extent what John has added to that. And I think these are really important things that we can talk about. And I actually, honestly, I don't see what this has to do with academic freedom. I was wondering if you could articulate to me how you see what you were arguing for, and John as well. How is that related to academic freedom, or how does it impact on it? Or I don't see the connection at all, actually.
Okay, I suppose the way I would look at it, I suppose I made it with the comment the piper pays, who pays the piper calls the tune, and the sense that came through in some of the questions later on was the commercialisation of universities, and it's a typical example. The activation programmes that the government have put in place in the last 2 years have been very focused. So they've said there is extra funding in ICT, there's extra funding in the green economy, in some financial economic programmes as well. So to a certain extent, the HEA was saying, if you want more funding, these are the areas you actually have to develop within your university. So that's what I'm saying. Is that curtailing your academic freedom? I don't know. It's allowing you to say, well, we don't want to run these programs, therefore we won't take your money. But maybe it's saying, well, I can't do research in rocket science because the government isn't giving me more funding for it. But that's where I'm coming from. But I would actually like to address what Kathleen said, and it does relate a little to what you're saying as well. I totally believe that it's hugely important. I have a humanitarian background, social science degree. Hugely important that the humanities gets funding. It's not an either or. It's just the constraints that are here at a time when we have economic difficulties in the country. But I think the most important thing, hugely important, is a rounded education. Every single one of the reports that the expert group has done in the last 5 years has said entrepreneurship, communication skills, critical thinking. So my point is to the university, you have got all of these structures within you. You've got all these disciplines here. Rather than siloing, why don't you start talking to each other so that the graduates are getting what I would call not just the STEM, but I've made this point before. What's uniquely important in Ireland to Irish people and Irish graduates and undergraduates is what I call their DNA in the humanities, in the arts and in writing and in music. We've got all that. Why don't we fuse that in with the science and technology? It's not an either or. It's just getting that roundness there and getting the universities to pick up the challenge and say, why don't I talk to somebody in humanities? Because we need people to be articulate as well as being able to be rocket scientists. So it's not an either or for me either.
I'm going to let Michael come in briefly, and then I have 2 people who've indicated up here and 2 over here, and I'll take them and then I'll go to the next lot. Yeah. So quickly now.
But I think something that Maynooth just articulated, I think some of the real problems in the kind of humanities and science collaboration, and certainly my experience of it, is that very frequently you get people saying, yes, it's absolutely right, we'd like to have the humanities and social sciences involved in science. But what you find time and time again, as seen as with funding bids, is you've got 2 particular functions. One is what I call the speak proper function, to make a communicative, coherent case for what scientists do, with the assumption that scientists can't articulate their own research, which I always find somewhat condescending. And I think the second one then is that you become the kind of the aesthetic funny bunnies. You can do sort of interesting PowerPoint presentations to kind of make the case for science somewhat stronger. And then thirdly, on a slightly more serious note, is the kind of the ethical thing. There's a kind of that the humanities and social science can bring a kind of an ethical dimension to what science does. But ultimately, what is suggested by all of that is that what the humanities and social sciences become is a kind of coda to the sciences in very it seems to be kind of very structurally restricted ways, rather than asking a more profound question, which is what the humanities and social sciences can do in redefining the notion of employability, and what a society does when it employs people and what it employs people for. Because one of the things that, without wishing to stray too far from the topic, but one of the big questions that's hanging over, of course, our whole society and economy is the nature of economic activity that we're engaged in. Is it sustainable in the medium to long term and so on, and the particular nature of the way in which the shift from money spent on wages and salaries to money that's going to shares and investments and so on, well, that's producing kinds of employment patterns that are not deeply destructive of our societies, and we can see this with the current sort of Euro crisis. So I think there's all kinds of, but I do think there's a real problem in the way in which that kind of science-humanities interaction is often articulated.
Great, I'm going to go on. Yeah, so this gentleman here.
Just coming back a bit more to academic freedom and actually connecting to the point that was made here before the panel and to questions of economics, the point made by the panel. I think one of the biggest threats to academic freedom and to the development of disciplines in the universities is the very fact that we are under the extreme economic stress, in the sense that if you go looking for funding, you won't be able, in certain areas, won't find, and that the policy and the strategy of research funding or research in university, not even research funding, research in university, is geared towards maximizing the amount of money the university can obtain from funding bodies. So disciplines in the fringe, like mine, music, become like something that somehow sort of thrown to the side, and we do research at our own peril. So we have, we still have our long hours to teach, and we have to do research on the side, and because there's no coherent strategy to support areas that are not really in the kind of the eyes of the funding agencies. So in consequence, our academic freedom becomes curbed because we are not able to develop our own work, our academic work. So this is a kind of commentary, but I was wondering whether you have any views that can inform the policy in the university regarding this, because I see this time and time again from the way that the policies is instructed to us through the faculties and through the various bodies of the supporting research, that there's no money for humanities. Okay. There's very little money for arts. There's very little money for science disciplines.
Right. Okay, so in a way you're raising the issue of whether those disciplines are becoming residualised because they're not on funding streams. But can we just leave that for a moment and maybe take the gentleman behind, I think was indicating earlier? We just take a couple of questions together and then come back to the panel, okay? So yourself.
I'm David. I just wanted to ask a question about accountability. Because we spend a lot of time at this university on accountability, and we spend a lot of money on accountability on external examiners, which cost lots and lots of money. On the time that we spend each year going through reams of exams, thank the Lord, like England, we do not yet have double marking, because that would cost more money. But we do have other things that were more recent. While they were deregulating the banks, we got things like the PMDS, then we got SIF, then we got FEC. And I wonder who the sick people downtown are who are thinking of these acronyms, but at the same time, I worry about how all of these exercises, which, believe you me, academics are intelligent enough to turn to their own purposes, and they do. We can manipulate these things very easily, so they can represent box ticking in any sort of fashion we want them to. So I sincerely doubt their effectiveness, but I certainly do know they create a culture where people are on another acronym that's CYA, cover your assets. People are spending more time ticking boxes and are being detracted from teaching. Now, this is not a money matter. This is a time matter. We're being distracted from research because we don't have a lot of time, because in the administration, which is facilitating our research and our teaching, is actually putting pressure on us to do all sorts of exercises.
Okay.
I have a problem with accountability.
Okay, thank you, David. I'm sorry to recognize you from there. So the iron cage of bureaucracy that they were predicted swallowing the university. I'm going to take Jane Gray as her hand up, and then the gentleman with the beard.
Thank you, Mary. I'm Jane Gray from the Department of Sociology, and I'm a little bit surprised that with respect to the whole point about relevance, that none of the panel have taken up, I think, one of the most important points made by the first speaker, which is that it's actually inefficient to try to channel academic research into certain areas. It stifles innovation. It wastes money. I'm always myself astonished by why it is that governments that constantly emphasize that markets are better able to adapt and to provide goods and services, and so that you shouldn't try to regulate markets or you shouldn't try to regulate business, the same governments that subscribe to that belief vehemently seem to think that some kind of central planning is the best way to design and promote academic research and academic endeavour. So I would be very interested to hear how some of the speakers on the panel, particularly I guess John and Una, would respond to that point.
Okay, thank you very much, Jane. And Pat, yeah, just see on there.
Thank you. I just wanted to perhaps come in from another angle, because I think that it's becoming increasingly clear that academic freedom is extremely important from the point of view of society and democracy and control in society and the function of society, because the academic freedom as an institution, it provides a situation where academics can, as disinterested intellectuals or experts, can actually inform the public of what's going on. And of course, the classic case is that, on the board of the central bank, when they borrowed the 90 billion, there was union leaders, business leaders, state leaders, leaders of the self-employed professions, every single one of them. And we had to, Morgan Kelly had to rely on his academic freedom to tell us that this was fake, that this was a house of cards. And real pressures were exerted on Morgan Kelly in relation to those developments, and we should be very grateful to him that he resisted those pressures. And of course, there are much wider angles about public information, and my colleague here in relation to engineering, structures, science, chemicals, medicine, all the various dangers, how very important it is that academics can feel free to tell the truth in the face of many of the pressures that are around nowadays, and that are actually strengthening. And I was a little bit concerned, now I hope John can reassure me, when he talked about moving from legal protection for academic freedom to earning the respect of society. Because I come from the Institute of Technology sector, and the things that are going on there, where there's no Universities Act at the moment, are an absolute nightmare. If they were translated into the universities, there would rightly be, and I hope there would be, an absolute outrage. Because, you see, there are new bishops in this society. There are people who own half the media. The stuff that's going on in the media every day in informing public opinion is clearly being determined by a power agenda from power elites. For example, the attacks on the public service and so on. There's a totally unbalanced situation. So I wouldn't like anyone to be, you see, what is respect in society? As academics, we want the respect of our students, the respect of our colleagues. But what does the respect of society mean?
Okay, I think that's a very good point. I think Richard Sanders actually wrote a book trying to deconstruct what it meant. I think I'll just leave it for a second and maybe go back to the panel and offer them the opportunity to respond, because there's the issue raised latterly of respect and truth-telling in society. There's the issue of accountability and the bureaucratisation of the university. There's the issue of inefficiencies if you try to determine everything centrally, rather than allowing people to work to their own agendas, and the issue of some departments becoming residualised in a sense because the agenda or the juggernaut is moving towards science, technology, smart economy, knowledge society, etc. So I don't know, would you like to come in there, John?
Yes, I think there's a broad range of questions there, and I don't think we can address them all here today. But if the first gentleman and another gentleman raised a question about the connection between academic freedom and funding and so on, I think that we need to talk about academic freedom disconnected from funding, because I think that I think that's important to do so. I think if we look at the whole fabric of central planning that's spoken about, I think that the point has been missed about the system of higher education, where we have a number of institutions, and you know, those institutions should have as much autonomy as is possible. And there are certain constraints today because of the economic climate, and the economic control, the employment control framework has been mentioned, and I will not defend that, because I think the principle of control is something that I would have a problem with generally. So I'd be an advocate for institutional autonomy, where both the benefits and the accountability for what happens in an institution becomes the import of what is important in the institution. Now, I want to raise it then above the institution. At system level, there must also be coherence. Coherence in terms of the mission and the diverse missions of the aggregate of the combination of institutions in Ireland. And that must be there to serve a purpose. And for me, there are three things they try to serve. We try to produce graduates who are employable and can go out there and drive economic activity. There are things that must happen within institutions and in other parts of what we call the community to drive societal change and improvement and betterment, and all driven by the better good. And the third one is the creation of new knowledge. And we're not serving the entities very well if we're not driving all three. So in that regard, from a let's call it an exchequer point of view, it is from there most of the funding comes today. And as soon as institutions can find alternative sources of funding, then their level of institutional autonomy will grow dramatically, and they will be able to, as I would see it, sow the seeds of research in wherever they wish as an institution to do so. And in that, I think in that framework, give greater freedom to research things that are not part of the common agenda, or what we call the general consensus agenda. And I think it's important that we get to that stage. We may not be there today, and it might take a number of years to get there, but the objective should be such. So central planning should only to plan for the system, rather than planning for what is done and how it's done. And I think that as long as we have limited resources, then you'll have a certain amount of what I would call central coordination, such that we're meeting coherence both on producing of resources for industry, both on investing in research and priority areas, and those priority areas will be governed by where we, Ireland Inc., see ourselves specialising, and we know in a global world that we can't specialise in everything, so we must choose where we sow the foundations. But behind all that, there's another area, the generic skills, the core area, and we spoke about the humanities and the arts earlier. And we are a nation which have natural talents in this area, and we be today seen as one of the major contributors to the debate around arts and humanities. So I think that if we can conceive of that framework, then I think we get a better understanding of how we can influence academic freedom. I think the only tenet of the academic freedom that poses me some difficulty is the whole area of security of tenure and contracts of indefinite duration. And I think that's a real challenge when we look at modern society and the information age and the knowledge economy. That is a legacy from the past that needs to be brought up to date. I'm not saying that we should hire and fire and so on as we go along, but we have to bring a new thinking to that. So with that thought, I close
okay, that rather. controversial thought. But can I hand over to Kathleen Lynch maybe to...
Well, I'll just say something about accountability. First of all, we live in a society where, yes, we need to be employed, and people are employed, but we also have a duty in the universities to service civil society. And I think that one of the things that is forgotten in this whole argument about accountability is if the only thing that mattered was to service the economy. We actually have a duty to educate people to be political citizens, to be social citizens, and I do note that when people talk about the arts humanities, they leave out the social sciences. And I find that very disturbing. Very, very disturbing. Because when Margaret Thatcher got into power in Britain, the first departments she closed down were sociology. Why? Because sociology and other disciplines that are associated are well known for their critical thinking and their diverse paradigmatic frameworks, all of which often are in conflict with another, which actually lead to dissent and actually question people in power. So I'm absolutely believing we are accountable. But we are accountable to poor people. We're accountable to old people who are not at work. We're accountable to children. We're accountable to many people who are not going to be at the negotiating table in Forfás or anywhere else. So I actually think that we must remember that the university is not only servicing the economy, because many of us will not spend all our lives in the economy. Indeed, in our childhood and our old age, we most certainly will not be in it. So I think that that's very important to remember. On the other question of, I suppose one of the things that struck me when you were speaking about fear, and that I think that, you know, insecurity in employment and that does create fear. It does create fear, and surveillance creates fear. And there is an awful lot of research working on this in the field of research written about this now, that people are fearful, and if people are fearful, they will be more conventional. They will, like the last speaker showed in his slides, the universities with where there's greatest autonomy and freedom are the places that are most productive. So I think if we have constant surveillance, constant overseeing, then you have a danger. Not that I never argued against accountability, I think it's extremely important, but I always say accountability to whom and for what.
Okay, great. Yeah, Michael.
So if I just go on a point which is the next question of accountability, but a certain kind of meta level, which is when we talk about accountability, or at least the way in which it's presented to us, it's almost invariably in quantifiable terms. There's a kind of sort of fundamental sort of digital paradigm here that everything can be converted to binary code, that anything we do in terms of teaching, research, publishing, or so on, can actually be converted to numbers, can be turned into a quantity. So what you're getting is a kind of a quantitative grid then that gets put onto to people's lives. And what that then leads to is what sociologists call a form of deep acting. It's kind of a performativity, a bit like they used to say in the old Soviet Union, you pretend to pay us, we pretend to work. You pretend to analyse us, and we pretend to be analysed. So it's this kind of grid. So what you get in these kind of these grids of accountability, is deeper and deeper forms of acting. So to some extent, I mean, the most profound postmodernists of all, neoliberals, who believe in a kind of an unending hermeneutics of suspicion, that you dig deeper and deeper and deeper with your figures in order to find out what people are actually doing. But what happens, of course, is people just adapt their behaviour then to put up a fiction that allows them to continue on. But I think this, in relation to that kind of the kind of the triumph of the quantitative, there's also the kind of notion, I mean, and just to go back to a point that was made earlier, is whether in fact you could uncouple a notion of systemic coherence from, if you like, individual autonomy or independence. That the problem is, and this is, if you look at the changing managerial structures in the university and so on, the kind of the greater degree of intervention by the department and other agencies in running of universities, is that the actual autonomy of universities, which is officially enshrined in university acts, is fatally compromised at individual university level by the need to conform to whatever happens to be flavour of the month or the particular directives that come from the Department of Education or elsewhere, increasingly the Department of Trade, Enterprise and in Employment.
Okay, all right. Right, we have a couple of more questions, I think. So I'm going to take this lady in the front first, and then the President, and then Mike Jennings. Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, Gavin.
Gantech School of English, Media and Theatre Studies. I think it's interesting, one of the few things that seems to unite the panel, at least linguistically, is the idea of critical skills, but I'm pretty sure there's some different understandings of what critical skills involve. So just wondering if the panel could talk a little bit about that.
Because critical skills is one of these ideas that has emerged very much in writing about education in the kind of post-Celtic Tiger era, particularly in pieces in the Irish Times that analyse the lack of fitness for purpose of the universities or of schools to deliver what's required. So just wondering if we could talk a little bit about what critical skills actually involve in terms of modes of thought, for example. And with respect, I think I know what Michael and Kathleen would have to say about that to a greater extent, so I'd be interested in hearing Una and John on that in particular.
Okay. I'm going to just park it for a minute and collect a few questions. So did you want to pose them yourself?
Me?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Yes, you're next.
Just briefly, I just want to comment on a rhetorical maneuver that I am very familiar with from the British context, which is around this whole idea of disrespect. And it's an elaborate maneuver whereby you tell academics that they need to earn respect by first disrespecting them, and by suggesting that somehow academics are constitutively unable to engage with ideas like reality, relevance, pragmatics, just very obvious, boring, standard ideas that any academic could define for you and write entire essays on. This idea that academics are disengaged from the world and they live in their little ivory tower, and then people need to come in from outside and explain to them that there is a society out there and we must be relevant and you must earn their respect. This kind of infantilizing of academics has to stop. The second thing I have to ask is of the people who are doing this infantilizing and the institutions you come from, what gives you the right to determine and define the public good, or to represent relevance, or to represent larger society, bandying words like context and pragmatics and reality. So I'm just curious, what gives you a special purchase on the idea of relevance, reality, and the public?
Okay, thank you. And so it's the President, and then it's Mike Jennings, and then we'll pause and give the panel a chance to respond.
I actually have a monitor version of that question.
Freedom of speech.
I think, so let me just start by saying, because I have an opportunity to comment later, that I believe in academic freedom, and I think the case for it has been very well articulated. In fact, I believe in it so strongly, I think can sometimes be dangerous to argue for it in a consequentialist way, because then people begin to challenge and unpick the validity of the presumed consequences. So I believe it's a fundamental public good. But in fairness to the people who might be trying to contextualise it first, we have had quite a long discussion about it with no significant reference to duties that go with it. And related to that, we had an argument about accountability, and I think Kathleen put it right. And, in fact, the question was appropriately phrased. There wasn't a difficulty with accountability, there's a difficulty with performativity. So I would be interested to hear the views of the panel about how we best go about articulating the freedoms and the duties to quality, for instance, to productivity in the way that we understand it. And then perhaps a little bit more also about, I think it's important for us to also articulate how we maintain, if not rebuild, public trust in the necessity for the freedom, and then how we operate within that freedom. So I'm interested to hear the perspectives on those things about that type of accountability, the accountability that supports trust, and also the duties that are consequential on academic freedom.
Great, thank you. And just take Mike Jennings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. I wanted to put a question directly to John. John, I don't know how this makes you feel, but in my opinion, you are the most influential man in this room. You sit around the table, which is the source of letters which influence the daily life of the people in this room in a very, very direct way. Not always in a welcome way, I would say. But it's almost spooky that you answered the question that I had intended to ask you. So I'm now going to have to rephrase the question to get an opportunity not to abuse the chair's indulgence. And it's got to do with the connection between academic freedom and tenure in security of employment. Because my question originally was going to be that it's all very well for people to be in favour of academic freedom in a loose or a generalised sense, but if the bodies that they are working with are producing conditions which directly compromise academic freedom, I think that you'd have to drill down a bit more and see what is our shared understanding of academic freedom. I believe very, very strongly, and I think that without trying to intimidate the argument, that most publications on academic freedom, most statements in favour of academic freedom, almost immediately go on to refer to the importance of tenure as a guarantee of that very freedom. And the excellent statement produced by NUIM itself last May makes the direct connection between tenure and academic freedom. And so my question would be, how can you reconcile, if I'm not misinterpreting what you say, your support for academic freedom with your apparent non-support for the very concept of tenure, which is seen almost universally worldwide as being an essential precondition for academic freedom, or more prosaically, how does one think that people are more likely to behave free and imaginatively and productively if they're in fear rather than secure?
Okay. All right, thank you. Right, so we've got 10 minutes and we've got 4 issues there that have to be addressed. I think I'll just start by asking Una maybe to address the critical skills one and what's meant by that, by non-academic. Sorry, critical thinking.
Okay, well, it's almost goes down to much the same. I think, and you can't blame the universities or third level institutions for this because it doesn't start at primary and pre-primary level where it should do. Where we should be looking at an education system which allows, it's not just rote learning. So you get the product of our education system, which is not necessarily the product that would be the best product to get. But when we looked at the studies and we went around and we asked, both this is academic reports, and we looked at industry and we looked at jobs generally. What was looked for from graduates were, and I actually have a list of them, so I'll just bring them out: entrepreneurship, commercial awareness, sustainability, critical thinking, problem solving, self-directed learning, maths, finance, ICT, foreign language, creativity, communications and teamwork. Now, there you go, put it up to you. But that's basically an all-round, what we're looking at, an all-rounder coming out. How do you do that? I don't know. But I don't think it starts at third level. I think a lot of that starts at preschool, at primary, and levels like that. But they're the sort of things that make people employable, that make people good at their job, no matter what their speciality is. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what's.
Not particularly, because within the list was the idea of critical thinking, and
yes.
I was wondering if you could unpack that.
To deconstruct that a little bit.
Yeah,
like when you guys in business or in commerce, you know, think about someone or evaluate someone as being a great critical thinker, what do you actually mean by that?
I suppose it's somebody who can be fairly objective, or somebody and somebody who can be innovative in their thinking. And can I just finish that one, because there was a point made up earlier about leadership on boards, and I thought to myself, that's a very interesting comment, but they're all graduates of universities of Ireland, all the people around the country into the ground. So there's an element here of what are we producing. I know there probably weren't too many academics on those boards, but they were products of the universities. So, you know, we have to, that's the critical thinking.
Berkeley went to London School of Economics.
Okay. All right. We're not going to comment on his educational pedigree.
Sorry, John.
I'm going to ask maybe. Yeah, I was going to let you come back in at the end.
Just on the critical skills, I think it's important to orient that towards problem solving. And I'm talking about not only engineering problems and scientific problems, but societal problems, that the problems with creating new knowledge and everything that goes with it. So it's really to address that, and I think you're right. The majority of the people now entering into influential positions in industry are people who have come through the universities. And in that we need to reflect on outcomes and see what in addition to what we're doing can we influence the production line, if we can look at it like that.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to ask maybe Michael and Kathleen if they would address the question about accountability, freedom, academic freedom coming with a set of duties, and how we think about the public trust, and if we owe a debt, or if there is, how do we build or rebuild a public trust?
Yeah, well, to some extent, but that kind of supposes that the public trust has been violated in the first place. I mean, one of the things that's very striking is that there's this kind of assumption that public trust in the university system is broken down. Yet last year, I made a very determined effort to try and find hard evidence on a wide-ranging, deep, closely argued sociological analysis of what the Irish people or public thought of the university system, and I simply couldn't find it. In other words, a lot of the kind of, there's a kind of rhetorical position rather than something, if you like, that's empirically grounded, and we're asked to kind of produce evidence-based arguments. But this kind of notion that the trust is broken down in the university system is one that's still yet to be proved.
But would you not accept that trust is broken or has been challenged around public institutions in our society? That the public are encouraged to think critically about public institutions, and we happen to be one of those.
Well, absolutely, and I think the public is encouraged to think critically about public institutions for reasons that are highly dubious. It's part of a particular kind of. But anyway, leaving that aside, it seems to me to take up with the President's point there about duties. I mean, I think that is important, that notion of duty and the one to engage in critical thought. If I could just very, very briefly define what I would think it sees critical thinking, I think it's a form of thinking where the truth is not something that's transparently self-evident. If I could just take up an intervention there from the floor about the notion of reality, which is taking something that's completely self-evident. I mean, there's nothing self-evident about reality. You can see it in financial economics, where the notion of reality, which has catastrophic consequences in people's lives, is anything but some kind of objective grounding in reality. So I think that the problem is that if you look at the goals, the things that we're asked to pursue, quality, excellence, the problem about these words, I mean, linguistically, we call them semantic free floaters. In other words, you can put whatever content you like into them. It's a bit, like Robert Pirsig.
Put some content into them for me.
Yeah.
There was a question there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to give you one answer to that would be the Royal Irish Academy, its Humanities and Social Sciences Committee produced a document on key performance indicators, which were generated from within the disciplines themselves, what they would see as important or valuable outcomes in terms of what they did. And what was interesting about those this term, which I particularly like, this key performance indicator, was that how many of the criteria that they invoked were non-metrical criteria in terms of what they really felt was important in terms of the discipline. But just in terms of tenure and academic freedom, the question was raised by Jennings and alluded to by John and Paddy Healy, is what's very, very striking, and you mentioned Sennett's work, I mean, his book, The Corrosion of Character, where he talks about this, the effects, the study he did of corporate life in the States, of the effects of flexibilization on people's lives, and just how destructive of the value system it was. But what's kind of interesting coming out of that is that you've got to ask yourself, why do we always bottom? Why don't we have a race to the top? In other words, why is it impossible to conceive of a society where something like proper work-life balance, where security of employment and the enjoyment of public goods is not seen as the ultimate goal of a university system, an educational system, rather than what we get is a kind of paradigm of this eternal race to the bottom, the kind of flexibilization, short-termization of people in the workforce.
Okay. Do you want to say anything, Kathleen?
Yes, I do. I just want to give a fact, actually, if I may. The ECOFIN study. There is an impression given that there is a huge crisis in Ireland. Well, I have the data from the ECOFIN study in front of me, and it shows 2010 that, in fact, Ireland, the Netherlands, Sweden, UK, Denmark are, in fact, the most cost-efficient countries for higher education in Europe. And Ireland was ranked highest of all countries in the International Recruiter of Graduate Employability. So I would say, Christ, if we were able to be employed internationally, what's the problem in Ireland? Don't blame the people for producing employable people whom the country has run in such a manner that we haven't even managed to create an infrastructure to employ them. So that, I think, is the problem. You know, I suppose I'm a bit despairing when I hear some of these discussions. I am a great critic of the universities. Anybody who's worked with me knows that I am. There are many things I think that could be changed internally. For example, I'll give a few practical examples. I believe that the professional education of a lot of professional interest groups in this country needs radical change. Have I ever heard somebody from a medical faculty write a paper on the two-tiered health system that we have and critique their colleagues? No, I haven't. Have I heard somebody from the teaching profession criticise some of the vested interests and the fact that the National Council for Curriculum Assessment is a body run entirely from within the education sector, so nobody from the outside can actually redefine what we study and how we study at second level schools? I'm sorry, no. So I think there are a lot of very awkward questions to be asked about professional education across the university sector. Very awkward questions and very uncomfortable questions. And they are about the ethics of how we behave and how we teach our students to actually be responsible to society, not just responsible to the profession. So that is the first, I would say. I would also say, for example, talking about critical skills, I agree. And I have a Maynooth Education Department adult community has been exemplary in this, and so have other departments. Marrying experiential knowledge with theoretical knowledge. I believe there should be research coalitions between academy and society, but that not just with industry. We need funding to do that with civil society, with community groups, with schools, so that we have actually create new forms of understanding. And I mean, if you read what's written by the European Science Foundation, the European Research Council, Helena Nowotny, about the notion of transdisciplinarity. Well, a lot of it is about creating new paradigms and new models and ways of doing research. We're not even talking about that in Ireland. It hasn't even entered the academic. Still in our disciplinary silos in how we're funding. And I remember my colleagues in maths, whom I'm very good friends with, preparing out I thought was a brilliant proposal in UCD, aligning education and mathematics with science. They weren't funded. Why? Because it was too much, it wasn't specifically in the Science Foundation Ireland category. So I think that that's another problem. So if you want that, you need to create new models, new frameworks, and don't make the crisis where there isn't one, and maybe some internal reflection too.
Okay, I just want to give John the chance to reply in just a minute, because we are a few minutes over. The question was asked of you about this disjuncture that you see between academic freedom and tenure, and whether or not HEA infantilise academics, and how come it is you who get to define the public good. So you've got 60 seconds starting now.
Well, that will be difficult. I think the first, I think the core point that was raised was how do I reconcile academic freedom and security of tenure, or my views on security. And I think in relation to that, I think that the old statement of security tenure, as was articulated over the centuries, I think that needs to be brought up to date. That's my point. I do believe that that people do need some form of permanency, at least through time-limited something like that, in order to bring out the best and to be able to challenge the status quo, to create what is new, and so on. So I think in that context, that answers that. I wanted to comment on this race to the bottom. I hear this quite a lot nationally. I travelled the world for a good many years and spent a lot of time out of Ireland. I think we need to be careful as a society in Ireland. We are our own worst enemy when it comes to criticising ourselves. I think that to the bottom are something that do not fit with me. I think that we have a lot of problems, but certainly we're not on a race to the bottom. We have too many good people. We have too many good people in places that are pushing the boats and the boundaries out. And I think that I wouldn't like to see that self-destruct. We have I hope we haven't too many media people here, but I think that the media today works on spin, short-termism, and any good story is to them, they will ignore it. And with relation then to the other question of the, who's advocating what is common good, I think that we all play a role in that. It's not something that is reserved of. And I think in relation to academic freedom and security tenure, there's one thing I would like to say is that you cannot make people listen to you. And when I talk about earning respect, you must contextually hear you. It's a fundamental communication thing that is important to do. And I believe that the strength and the importance of academic freedom in the future is going to become more important, because we as citizens are going to encounter problems like we've encountered in the last 3 years. Who foresaw them? And if they did foresee them, what did they do about it? There's no point in screaming from a rooftop and not creating the message so that it's heard. So in summary, whilst I think that Mary opened it by talking about I being a purebred industrialist, quoting from something in the Irish Times, I think that in the role that I come from industry, but in the role I have in the authority, I've spent the last 2 months advocating for the retention of the exchequer funds that are currently there to be retained for higher education. Ireland in the future will depend on higher education, and higher education in the primary school. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, John, for that. And we're delighted that you've been advocating on our behalf in the corridors of power. It's 4:20 now, and I'm sure everybody's dying for a cup of coffee. So we're going to have a 10-minute coffee break, and if we can reach a really engaging panel coming up for the second part of the afternoon. Thank you very much. I'd like to express our appreciation.